It's a pleasure for me to welcome members of the Huntington and new audiences to our 2021 Founders Day program. Back in 1933, the director of research at the Huntington, Max Farrand, noted in the Huntington's annual report that February 27th, Henry Huntington's birthday, had officially been designated as Founders Day by the Board of Trustees, and that the fledgling institution had followed the custom of observing simple exercises in the rare book reading room in Mr. Huntington's honor. The talk that year was given by Dr. Frank P. Hill, a former visiting scholar at the Huntington Library and librarian emeritus of the Brooklyn Public Library, and his talk was entitled Research at the Huntington Library. It was a rather internal affair, presented to a small audience of Huntington's descendants, as well as the 5 Huntington trustees and their families. Fortunately, this small gathering has blossomed in the intervening years. In recent years, we've been thrilled to welcome hundreds of people annually over 2 days to hear our Founders Day talks in our spectacular Rothenberg Auditorium at the Huntington. Today, we are really delighted to have the opportunity to throw the virtual door open even wider to attendees from across the US and around the world. Last year, on the occasion of our centennial, we formally renamed Founders Day, making a small but crucial punctuation change from founders with an apostrophe S, signifying one founder, to founders with an S apostrophe, signifying founders plural, in order to recognize the contributions of both Henry and Arabella Huntington in envisioning and establishing the institution. Today's program will bring another Huntington into the mix, Archer, Arabella's son and Henry's stepson, who had great interest in the Spanish-speaking world. In fact, Archer helped found the Hispanic Society of America. A warm welcome to staff and members of the Society who are joining us today to hear Dennis Carr and Sandy Rodriguez delve into the history of the Huntington family and jointly explore possibilities of how we can reconceive and expand the stories we tell in our collections and our galleries. Please join me in welcoming Christina Nielsen, Hannah and Russell Cully, director of the Art Museum at the Huntington, who will introduce our 2 featured guests tonight. Christina, take it away.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome everyone. It is a real delight to be zooming out Founders, plural, Day lecture to all of you. I have the great honor of introducing the speakers for today, our Chief Curator of American Art, Dennis Carr, and very special guest, Sandy Rodriguez, LA-based artist and current Caltech-Huntington Art and Research resident. A little bit more about each of them. They will both be speaking, then engaging in conversation. And at the end, roughly 4:45, we will open up to questions from the audience. So please, as questions pop into your head while you're listening to Dennis and Sandy, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and put your questions in. We'll be happy to take those at the end. Dennis Carr, the Virginia Steele Scott Curator, Chief Curator of American Art in the Huntington's Art Museum, arrived at the Huntington just over 1 year ago from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where he had served for many years as the Carolyn and Peter Lynch Curator of American Decorative Arts and Sculpture. In 2010, he was the co-curator of the MFA's 53 Gallery, Art of the Americas Wing, which reoriented American art with a hemispheric focus. And he has led efforts within the department there and is exploring options here for thinking about expanding the collections of American, Latin American, ancient American, and Native American art. expanding, as Karen said, the stories we tell in our galleries. Recent exhibitions of his include Made in the Americas, The New World Discovers Asia in 2015, and Collecting Stories, Native American Art in 2018. He has published extensively and was a contributor to Art and Industry in Early America in 2016, which won the Charles F. Montgomery Book Prize. He holds graduate degrees from Yale University in the History of Art and from the Winterthur Program in Early American Culture. Prior to joining the MFA in 2007, he had served in the departments of American Paintings and Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Yale University Art Gallery. We are thrilled to have him here. Sandy Rodriguez, LA-based painter, was raised on the border between California and Mexico, and her work investigates the methods and materials of painting across cultures and histories. Her Codex Rodriguez Mondragon is made up of a collection of maps and paintings about the intersections of history, social memory, contemporary politics, and cultural production. Rodriguez has exhibited at a number of institutions, including the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, Art and Practice here in LA, and the Riverside Art Museum. Her works have been featured in the LA Times, on KCET, and several radio programs, including KCRW's Press Play, CBC's Radio Canada, Our Le Monde, and KPCC's Off Ramp. Her works are featured parts of the collection of J.P. Morgan's Chase Art Collection in New York, LACMA here in Los Angeles, and the Amon Carter Museum of Art in Texas. She's a recipient of many awards, including, as I mentioned previously, the Caltech-Huntington Art and Research Residency. She's currently teaching a class at Caltech and working alongside Dennis on a reinstallation project, which you will hear about shortly. And a big shout out to our Caltech colleagues in the Humanities Department, particularly Dane Gilmore, if you're with us today or watch this link later. Sandy has also held residencies at Joshua Tree, through the City of LA COLA Master Arts Fellowship. She's been an artist in residence for the LA County Arts Commission and was an artist in residence at Art and Practice in Leamoth Park. I could go on, but I won't, because you need to hear from them, not me. So Dennis and Sandy, welcome again and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina, for the warm introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here this evening, and great to be here at the Huntington, working closely with you and the American Art Collection and so many wonderful colleagues across the institution. And welcome to everybody joining from home or offices or wherever you are. Today, I'll be speaking about the Huntingtons collecting legacy, and I'll be joined by our contemporary artist, Sandy Rodriguez. I'll begin with a brief introduction, and then Sandy will talk about her current work, followed by some time for conversation and questions. Sandy is helping us think about our collections and gallery spaces in new ways, and it's great to have her perspective as we chart the course for the collection in the coming years. Arabella and Henry Huntington were astoundingly broad collectors. Henry assembled one of the largest library collections in the United States, and Arabella's art collections were renowned in her own time, with a focus on old master paintings, Dutch and French works, some of which stayed in New York or went to the Metropolitan Museum or came here to California. They left behind for us the foundation of incredible gardens and library and art collections, which we have continued to grow and develop over the past 100 years. While the Huntington was renowned then, as it is now, for its British and American collections, there are remarkable treasures from the Spanish-speaking world related to Spain and to Latin America and other parts of the globe, in particular in the early modern period. Many of the items, like these two astounding views of a pineapple, Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo's manuscript drawing from the 1530s and 1540s, from his General and Natural History of the Indies on the right, and Maria Sibylla Merriam's view on the left from 1705, taken during her time traveling in Suriname. show the transatlantic and eventually the trans-Pacific exchanges that resulted from the first era of globalization and European naturalists' interest in endemic plant species in the Americas. There are also manuscripts and publications from New Spain, such as Alonso de Molina's early 1571 Dictionary of the Nahuatl language of Central Mexico, translated into Spanish, part of the Huntingtons' early collection. There is particular relevance here in California, which in the viceregal period was part of the viceroyalty of New Spain and of course governed from Mexico City. These kinds of materials are most often associated with the other side of the Huntington family, particularly Archer Huntington, son of Arabella and her first husband, Collis Huntington, who in 1904 founded the Hispanic Society of America in New York. It was then and continues to be the preeminent collection of Hispanic art and library material outside of Spain, and also has remarkable holdings related to Latin America and the Philippines. For the most part, Henry and Archer went their separate ways. In fact, Archer was quite territorial in his collecting and often counseled Henry to focus narrowly on his English collections. He wrote in 1919 in his diary that Henry is, quote, full of his plans for the new library, and I sing but one song, keep to English. And yet, there are many areas of overlap. Both were interested in maps, especially Spanish and Portuguese portolan or navigational charts from the 16th centuries, 17th century, showing the newly globalized world. After Archer had put together a world-class collection of such maps for his library in New York, he stopped collecting around World War I, and it was then that Henry Huntington picked up the mantle and built his own sizable and important collection of such material. This is one from the Huntingtons collection, which shows the coast of Brazil, 1547, showing indigenous and European figures and the kind of collision of cultures that occurred in the Americas in the 16th century, which was acquired by the noted antiquarian bookseller A.S.W. Rosenbach in 1924. Some of these narrative and historical threads came together brilliantly in a beautiful exhibition organized by the Huntington in 2018, Visual Voyages, Images of Latin American Nature from Columbus to Darwin, which was part of the last PST or Pacific Standard Time series of exhibition in Los Angeles. This show traced not only the European views of Latin America, but also indigenous perspectives from writers and artists who recorded critical histories and images in a rapidly changing world. Collecting has continued in this area all the way to the present, as Clay Stalls, our talented curator of California and Hispanic collections in the library, has been working closely with migrant families in California, collecting letters and family papers documenting trans-border and local histories. These largely textual sources offer a way of tracing or mapping migration patterns and familial relationships that cross borders. Such collecting is increasingly important and relevant, I would say urgent, in our current world when many communities are demanding social justice, and institutions like the Huntingtons seek to give greater visibility to communities that have long been marginalized, and to reflect upon the voices, stories, and narratives that we amplify and share. In the American Art Collection, we're working hard on this topic as well, especially through our current exhibition, Made in LA 2020, A Version, the Biennial of Contemporary Art and Artists in Los Angeles, organized in partnership with the Hammer Museum and curated by our wonderful colleagues there, Lauren Mackler, Mariam Ben-Salah, and Aikai Onyewenye. This exhibition sadly has been delayed due to COVID, but it's installed and ready to open as soon as we're safely able to do that. And we look forward to sharing it with you soon. In Made in LA, there are works by 30 important contemporary Los Angeles artists, such as Umar Rashid or Frohawk Two Feathers, whose diptych I show here presents powerful reimagining of landscape and history through an indigenous perspective, set in a Southern California landscape with Aztec or Mexica eagle warriors and black and brown figures who are not vanquished, but are rather victors, possessors of history, and are able to share, and shape their own narratives. The phrase scrawled across of this diptych in Spanish is a potent statement. El mundo es tuyo, the world is yours. And once Made in LA exhibition closes and we're able to reinstall our American art galleries, how will we tell the story of American art and American history? Who will be represented and what stories will we share? And how can we center new voices in our spaces, especially those who can help us see our historical collections in new ways and connect with diverse communities in Los Angeles and beyond? And how can we better connect the inside with the outside, engaging the landscapes around the galleries in the narratives we're telling, and to think about the many layers of indigenous, colonial, and contemporary histories of the land? As we are thinking through these questions, we are developing a reinstallation of our galleries on the theme of borderlands, to explore places where cultures came together or where artists crossed borders, to tell a history of American art that is multicultural and multilingual, and to think deeply about concepts of place, migration, and ecology as being central to art making. In this reinstallation, we'll have the opportunity to display masterworks from our collection, such as our magnificent painting by Frederick Edwin Church, an American artist, called Chimborazo, painted in 1864, which depicts a volcano in Ecuador Church had studied and sketched during 2 trips to South America in the 1850s, following in the footsteps of the great Prussian naturalist, Alexander von Humboldt. We will include material from our library holdings, such as Alexander von Humboldt's illustrations of scientific text related to his travels to Chimborazo, which served as the inspiration for Church. We'll also present views from across the Americas, North, Central, and South America, from the Arctic scenes of glaciers by William Bradford to the jewel-like paintings of hummingbirds and orchids by the American artist Martin Johnson Head that he painted based on sketches he made in the field in Brazil and Colombia and other parts of Central and South America. To Thomas Moran's view of the Rio Virgin in Utah, which he had seen for the first time traveling with John Wesley Powell's geological survey in the 1870s. We'll have a dedicated space for education, created by our education team in consort with the curators and with Sandy, focused on the theme of art and ecology. We'll explore the sources of the pigments that went into art making in the Americas, including some of the plants, botanical species that will probably be growing right outside of our galleries. And finally, this reinstallation will give us the opportunity to work with our 2 current artists in residence, both Latinx artists working in Los Angeles, Enrique Martinez Celaya, who's on the left, an artist who's probably well known to many at the Huntington, as his 2 wonderful bronze sculptures are on view in the gardens outside the American galleries. He's an artist whose work centers on issues of migration, displacement, exile, and movement across borders. And Sandy Rodriguez, who focuses on indigenous knowledge of pigments and artistic materials and systems of mapping. I feel so privileged to be able to work with both of these artists who have taught me so much, and especially today to be in conversation with Sandy. Sandy's work, as you'll soon see, is drawn from an exacting and careful study of the landscape, of traditional materials and historical texts. She creates images with hand-processed colors drawn from botanical and earth pigments, often painted on amate paper, a native bark paper traditionally used in Mexico. Her painting style is based on the style of indigenous manuscripts, mostly from the 16th century and mostly from New Spain, that were painted under colonial Spanish rule, which show the survival of indigenous artistic traditions and ways of using and understanding color. Sandy brings this work forward in both her botanical illustrations, often done during field studies, and her large-scale maps, which present perspectives on the land and of borders that are always deeply engaged with contemporary issues, often ripped right from the headlines, whether they be ice raids or family separations along the border or wildfires in California. To me, Sandy is an artist whose work, in a very interesting way, encapsulates the connections between the botanical collections at the Huntington, our library, and our art holdings, and it helps us engage with our historical objects in new ways. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sandy to talk more in depth about her work and about her current research as part of her residency as the Caltech-Huntington Art and Research Fellow.
Let me unmute, and thank you so much, Dennis, for inviting me to join you all today. Switch over. So I'd like to thank everyone here at the Huntington for inviting me to participate in the conversation today. I am delighted to be here with you and everyone. Welcome colleagues, family, friends. I'm setting a timer so that I know exactly how long I'm going. I'd like to begin with this first image and just kind of reiterate some of the points that you heard a little bit earlier about my series, the Codex Rodriguez Mondragon. It is a collection of maps and specimen paintings about the intersections of history, social memory, contemporary politics, and cultural production. It incorporates those hand-processed pigments and colorants onto a sacred and ceremonial and once outlawed amate paper, reclaiming and reaffirming the indigenous practices, artistic traditions of the Americas. The use of plant material is significant not only for situating the work within the specific floristic provinces of each region, but also for their medicinal and their healing properties. This makes the maps not simply a representation of place, but the objects that serve as an active embodiment of its constituent parts. In my work, I have a multitude of records, document maps, natural materials that serve to inform my interpretation of space, where various histories are combined, juxtaposed, recovered, re-envisioned, painted as a codex, a macro and micro view of humanity in relationship to land, time, and power. The image that you're seeing here is the latest work in progress. So this is the first look that I get to share with you all. And what you're looking at is a hybrid digital and analog sketch that was produced and researched thoroughly beginning in the fall of this year for a civic art opportunity. I'm continuing to research this as part of my Caltech-Huntington Art and Research Fellowship, and will be layering content over the next quarter. So what you see is a view of Los Angeles that includes contemporary names for locations, names of ranchos during the Rancho period, as well as the Gabrielino and Tongva names for mountains, waterways, and locations. The sketch presents a highly saturated composition. There will be celestial bodies that will be finished in the upper portion in 23 karat gold, and highlighting native flora, including an oak that you see on the left, Joshua tree Yucca brevifolia in the back, Opuntia basilaris, the nopal in the lower portion. And ultimately, this is going to be a 94 by 94 inch double panel map that shares the history of this place we call home. The title is You Are Here, Tovangar, El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora, la Reina de Los Ángeles, Porciúncula, Los Angeles. Oops. My investigations into indigenous color use in the Americas led me to research the Florentine Codex and the history of image and color making in colonial Mexico, which informs this series. The Florentine Codex is a 12-volume encyclopedia compiled by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún and 22 or 23 several indigenous writers and artists known in Nahuatl as Tlacuilos. Working during the middle of the 16th century, they created this compendium of all things of New Spain with parallel text that you see here in Spanish, Nahuatl, describing the deities, plants, animals, and the history of the Spanish invasion, 1519 to 21. Over 2,000 images accompany this text, providing a third layer of information. It's important to mention that this is created under a colonial regime at a time when the world was radically changing and was created in part amid a pandemic under quarantine that wiped out, this pandemic wiped out 90% of the population. While my movements have been minimal, as with all of you, outside of my apartment and studio this year, I have had great fortune to spend time at the Joshua Tree Highlands residency last year, and that is the image that you're looking at here, which is my desk in the studio in Joshua Tree, where you have a variety of botanical colorants, prepared earth pigments, and then a color chart where I'm matching the spring landscape of the desert. Here you'll see that I had the good fortune of working with an extraordinary colleague, Devlin Gandy, and I was able to go out and procure some ochre myself in the Southern California landscape. What happens when I get back to the studio is, after really analyzing and recording the locations of the materials, is the processing. So here you see a small amount in the palm of my hand that I then grind in a mortar pestle, grind and grind some more. This particular colorant was super fine and super soft, so it didn't require a whole lot of sifting or levigation. But then you see the mulling over on the right-hand side, which is the mixing on support to create the paint and to really suspend the particles evenly within the color. This is an image of my desk here at home, where you'll see that I test and log each color source into a color chart that then has notations about extraction times, pH levels, and any other information that'll help me replicate that handmade color. What you're seeing here is an installation from 2019 of a painting that is actually the pendant to the current piece that I'm working on. And it is called Rainbows, Grizzlies, Snakes, Oh My, Conquest to Caging in Los Angeles, 2019. This map makes visible the sites of human caging from the mission period to the present, set against a view of Los Angeles that features native flora and fauna under a large rainbow. The painting is created in a very restricted palette because of the alignment with Book 12 from the Florentine Codex that is created during a pandemic. So the image is very, very heavy with a lot of visual information, but very restricted in terms of color. I should also mention that this work makes visible the research by historian Kelly Lytle Hernandez in her publication that is basically describing how we end up as the carceral capital of the world. In addition to the double paneled map, I created 4 botanical specimens of native plants of Los Angeles for winter, summer, spring, and fall. Here you see a full folio that has the names in Tongva, Spanish, Nahuatl, Latin, and Common English, with oaks on the left and toyon on the right. 2 particular plants that you will see all over the grounds of the Huntington and just outside of and on the way to the American Art Galleries. Here you'll see my attempts at processing color from the toyon. And some of those experiments can be successful and some can be a good starting point for repeating those experiments. You'll also see on the right my drawings of a marigold and then my first attempts at extracting color from the petals. A lot of the times when I have these recipes, it doesn't necessarily state whether it's supposed to be from a dry or fresh plant, or if it's supposed to be the blooms, the bark, the root. So there's a lot of cross-referencing with a number of sources, including historic and contemporary database and information. There's a clearer view of the painting I just shared with you in the installation view that really privileges rainbows, grizzlies, and snakes prior to colonization as the native flora and fauna. This particular map is Mapa de la Región Fronteriza de Alta y Baja Califas. This is the first map of the entire series. And here I've gone into each of the California deserts for 5 days at a time with an herbalist studying the edible and medicinal plants of California. So from the Sonoran Desert to the Mojave Desert to the Great Basin Desert. At the same time, I'm researching the history of color in the Americas and key into book 11 and chapter 11 of the Florentine Codex to reinterpret some of those recipes for processing color. Here you'll see that I'm processing cochinilla nochesli or cochineal, and taking from the historic text that you see next to it, which is done in black and white, I've added some color and switched out portraits of myself for the portraits of the scribe scholar painters from 500 years ago. This is another moment where I really examine the current moment and pair it with the historic from the Florentine. And this is from the second map. But here we have the original source, and then you have a contemporary image from the news headlines. And this is a Bay Area artist, Julio Salgado, being arrested by ICE officers in Northern California. This is where I have the opportunity to really think about immigration raids. And looking back to book 12 of the Florentine Codex, you have a number of armed figures and marine vessels. Well, pairing that with contemporary looks at Customs Border Enforcement, marine, land, and air vehicles, I was able to make some very concrete decisions on how to integrate this into the mapa of the pronósticos and immigration raids in Califas. The gold that is used to produce, or sorry, the yellow is produced from this particular mushroom. This is Phalia schwintzii, which is lovingly referred to as butt rot. And I was in Northern California, about 2 hours north of San Francisco, and I procured this giant mushroom from the base of a conifer. They steal the nutrients from the conifers, and so it's okay to take them. But this thing, if you look down in the lower portion, is as wide as a man's chest and was wet. And I'm carrying it up a steep incline in a Trader Joe's bag while it's falling apart and getting wet until I can get it into my trunk, drive it home 9 hours south, and then research on mycopigment sources how to process this for color. But this is how we end up with that gorgeous yellow that I use for the Golden State. Here is a view of it at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, where it is currently installed. The last map of 2018 is Mapa of the Child Detention Center's Family Separations and Other Atrocities. And for this particular map, you're seeing sites of child detention, and it's layered by content that was pulled from ProPublica's report, Immigrant Child Shelters Near You. So I've layered medicinal plants from field studies across the US that include New Mexico, Nevada, and Colorado. It's inspired by an 1847 map that considers the land that was acquired by the US by conquest, annexation, and treaties over the past 147 years. In this map are colonial and neo-colonial images from the past and present, including the crying mothers from the Florentine Codex and images from news stories of children sleeping on the floor with emergency blankets in the Tornillo tent city in Texas, as well as other elements. You'll be able to see this one at the Denver Art Museum a little bit later this year. When I get ready to go out on field study, I sometimes fly in with 250-pound bags. In this particular trip, I had 250-pound bags, took the Amtrak out to New Mexico. But I bring small sheets of this sacred ceremonial amate paper, my art supplies, and I camp and drive across the region, really studying what I can about endemic plants within each region. Sometimes I will run across a feather, and in this case, I found the feather of a great horned owl, which I later then included into the map and created a drawing tool with it according to medieval recipes. This is a Western antler lichen that I picked up in New Mexico, and I processed it based on an archaeobotanist's recipes. Get all the way through 21 days of processing and fermenting this thing, only to realize that this only works on proteins, silk, wool, and certainly not cellulose. So I had to abort this particular experiment. The last installation that you may have seen here in Los Angeles is from an exhibition that was called You Will Not Be Forgotten. It was an exhibition dedicated to the 7 child migrants who died in US Customs Border Enforcement custody throughout 2018 and 2019. Here you see the portrait of Jacqueline Amy Rosemary Calmaquin, age 7, was one of the first child migrants who we heard about who died in Customs Border Protection custody. In the exhibition, I created portraits of each child with the year of their birth, the year of their death, and then included the sacred national bird of Guatemala just over the year of their birth, denoting their place of origin. I also included in this particular exhibition another colonial text, which is the Cruz Bariano, the rare books collection at the Huntington has one of the hardest to find books that I've been trying to track down, and I can't wait to get into the library and be able to use this particular text, but I have it open here on a page for Nonochton, which is for treating pain of the heart. And these are remedies that were created 500 years ago, but I include it in a double portrait over here on the right-hand side. There are also portraits of healers from this particular installation. These 2 will be on view along with 6 other objects in New York, opening mid-March at El Museo. And these are images of healers that I have collapsed into the modern time period by putting portraits of scholars that I'm currently working with. And one is for respiratory illness and the other one is for pain of the heart. This is the overall map, which is in the Eamon Carter's collection, where I include the recipe for trauma or susto, along with details that include studies from field study, images from news, video, images from the colonial period, and again, really take botanical studies, historic research, and the present moment and create these objects. Sometimes those smaller field study sketches will become these larger borderlands landscapes and will include journal entries along the bottom as you would find travel journals of the 19th century. Here again, we have 2 more plants from the Cruz Bariano, and it is part of that overall installation. So looking at how plant knowledge has been recorded and presented over time in the Americas is also very critical to the work that I'm doing. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. And thank you so much. I'm very excited to continue my conversation with Dennis about the work.
Great. Thank you, Sandy. That was absolutely terrific. It's wonderful to see all your work spread out over time. I'm going to start with a few questions and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Great.
To ask through the Q&A function. In my experience working with 16th century documents from Mexico, is that on the surface, they appear to have a very limited color palette, but when you actually do the materials analysis and get down to the pigments that are being used, it unveils a really complex set of colors that all had specific meanings. And so part of what historians and scientists have been working on is trying to, pull back these layers and get to a deeper understanding of these really important early documents. So in your current work, now I know you've focused more recently in California. So can you talk a little bit about the pigment sources and the specific pigments you've been using most recently?
Sure. And well, from our past conversations, Dennis, you've heard about so many of my experiments trying to extract color from organic sources, and those tend to be more fugitive colors. So it was a goal of mine at the end of last year to really take the opportunity of 2020 and now 2021 to understand the associations and histories of mineral-based colors in Southern California. And so really shifting from organic colors to mineral pigments, I've been doing a lot of research. And one of the materials that I'm most interested in experimenting with at the moment is red ochre. And so I'll tell you that the connection to histories in Southern California are just fascinating. When you think about something like red ochre, there's a text that I'm currently reading and sharing with my students. You hear about the Cocopa Indians and how this population that really spans Arizona, Baja, Sonora, have a narrative that goes really around their creator god Sipa. And the narrative goes on to explain that there's an entire story that explains why the red ochre is found, but it comes back to a narrative where Coyote, who is really, really bent on stealing the heart of this Lord Sipa, or this god Sipa, I should say, plucks his heart and carries it across the landscape running away, and where the great gouts of blood fall to the earth is where it is stained, and this is where red ochre is found. So if we're thinking about color sources and the range of colors being used in a codified way, there's a whole nother level of information that I need to really process. Because when we're thinking about reds in the colonial Mexican period, a translucent red like cochineal represents the solar realm. Opaque mineral red like hematite represents the underworld. And yet there's all these different layers of associations and reception of color from the times prior to the modern period, and then for our modern eyes that have so many colors to tend with.
Yeah, so one of the most poignant aspects of this project in the connection with the Florentine Codex in particular is that document, that huge encyclopedia, as you mentioned, was made during a time of pandemic. And I know that that is especially meaningful to you in your work. Can you talk a little bit about that in relation to the current project?
Sure. I'll tell you that having studied the Florentine for the past 4 years, and then especially having convened a group of writers in my studio each quarter and discussing the Florentine and it being created under the times of pandemic was something that we imagined. Like, imagine what that would be like to have to sequester yourself in the colegio while completing this artwork, and you can't, leave to get color. You can't even bring a glass of water to your sick and dying loved ones, was something that we've discussed and we've been in conversation about. To have that moment of pandemic become a reality, I ordered about 6 months worth of paper and pigments because I didn't know when I was going to be able to go out again. I really restricted my use of certain pigments that I had very little of, and did a lot of workarounds for trying to figure out how to continue doing the work with, limited opportunities for procuring more materials.
Yeah. And so tell us a little more about the class you're teaching at Caltech. I'm massively jealous. I want to be a student in your class. So tell me a little bit about what you're doing in the class and what the students are learning about.
So it has been an absolute joy to work with my students at Caltech. I'm teaching a course called Visual Narratives and Colors of the Americas. I was able to prepare a historic color box complete with mussel shells for mixing color, red ochre, yellow ochre, azurite, antlerite, chalk, charcoal, raw gum arabic, pH testing strips, a few other accoutrements, but essentially week by week, we do extensive amounts of reading around a colorant, process it, test it, and keep a color journal. The culmination of the 10-week course is to create a visual narrative and to explain the rationale for selecting certain colors and telling your visual narrative about your history or migration to the place that you call home. And with students spread out across Southern California and the East Coast and the Midwest, it is going to be a very interesting final presentation. But the sketchbooks, the weekly discussions, and then the unexpected outcomes of the continued personal experiments that are now incorporating various members of their households has been one of the most satisfying moments of the residency. Because like I said, we're in week 8 and we just didn't expect to be doing this all on Zoom. And it has its challenges, but it has been a real delight.
Yeah, so one of the great aspects of the project for the Huntington is that we're working together on this education space, which I mentioned, whose aim is to teach our audiences about the sources of pigments, which is not common knowledge. And I know that we're also working with our botanical staff to see about planting dye plants or other plants that yield artistic materials outside the American galleries, as they're already planted throughout the gardens. So it's already a strength of the Huntington. We're just going to maybe bring it a little closer to that space so that audiences can make those connections. And I know because we're in the middle of a pandemic, this residency and our partnership has not gone as easily as we might have wished. But I know the goal is for you to spend a lot of time at the Huntington, wandering the grounds, doing a lot of research on the grounds, but also in the library collections. So I know you're just kind of starting in this process, but do you have any kind of initial thoughts about what you've seen in the gardens at the Huntington, particularly dye yielding plants and other things?
Well, I think that there are several spreadsheets that I need to get through with all of the native plants of Mexico, and we're going through each floristic province and really kind of IDing which ones I'd like to do studies of, because ideally it would be a combination, like we discussed on multiple occasions, of spending a full day drawing from the botanical collection, then cross-referencing those with several rare books from the library, and then manifesting within the current project. But I am, as I said, just really excited to have the opportunity to go deeper with plants of the Americas and really focus in on those medicinal dye plants that have that intersection for both healing and yielding color. It is going to be really extraordinary when we do have a little bit more opportunity to get into the library and be able to do that cross-referencing and be able to look more closely at some of the assets that are a little bit harder to get to at the present moment.
Great. Look forward to it. So it's quarter of. I'm sure there are tons of questions from the audience. So I'm going to welcome Christina back in to the conversation.
Great. Hi. Thank you. Thank you, Dennis and Sandy. Thank you so much. It's been amazing over the last 45 minutes to see the sort of conflation of time and place and the way that you are really tapping the multidisciplinary strengths that we and the divergent collections that we have here at the Huntington. So thank you so much. We have a number of questions. So let me start going through them. Ted Bosley, hello Ted, is asking Sandy, can you tell us more about the Amate paper? What is it made of, how, by whom? And also thank you for sharing.
Wonderful question, and thank you so much. My paper is created by Efraín Daza Aparicio, and he is third generation Otomi paper maker. He began making paper at the age of 6 and really began experimenting more with the materials and techniques of creating the Amate paper at 12. But essentially what you're looking at is a pre-colonial material. As I said, this is a sacred ceremonial paper that was outlawed in the colonial period. Traditionally, it is made by amate or amatl, which is fig, and mulberry, sometimes mixed together, with the certain populations of trees that are available near Puebla and near San Pablito, where this paper is made. They're integrating other paper or other exterior barks. So the procedure is to take the exterior bark from either honote or ficus. Sometimes the barks change, but once that exterior bark is hand peeled, it is simmered in a lye and ash solution for up to 6 hours to break down the fibers. Once those fibers are broken down, they're removed from the water and they're nice and soft. Then they are masticized or knit together with a volcanic rock by pounding it against a wooden board. Now, there's a lot of different types of amate paper, but I use the single sheets, not the woven ones, not the other lacier ones. These take anywhere from 6 hours to multiple days to dry, depending on the thickness, because they're sun-baked in the sun. But this is a ceremonial paper that has been used by shaman for generations and generations, and has been used in ritual. It, again, was prohibited in the colonial period and then regains a new resurgence, and is an export that I procure from a paper distributor here in Los Angeles. But I can't wait to be able to go to San Pablito to go visit Efrain at the taller in Puebla, because that would be amazing.
Excellent. Quick question. Are there any insects that are sources for your pigments?
Oh, yes. The cochinilla, the scale insect that feeds on the opuntia, the cactus that you saw earlier in the slideshow. So this particular scale insect, only the female generates carmine, that beautiful bright red that you see in so many artworks and in so many modern day foods. So I would say out of all of the colors, that is the only one that is derived from an insect. But yes, it is, traditional name is Nochestli, but it goes by carmine.
A couple of questions related to conservation and the botanical pigments or the mineral pigments that you're using. Do the botanical pigments require any unique conservation techniques, and how permanent are they?
So with the more fugitive plant-based colors, a strategy that I've started using in about 2018 was to create a multiple layered technique. With watercolor, it's about layering prismatic layers of color. And when you know that you have what I call a limited time only color that is going to have dramatic changes, I will use a modern colorant, color match it as you would in a conservation lab, put one layer down and then infuse that next layer with the plant-based color so that the color loss is not as dramatic as one might anticipate.
Let me jump tracks for just a second and ask each of you a question about your practice. Sandy, you're artistic, but Dennis, let me start with you. Your curatorial practice. What has it meant to you, Dennis, in conversations with Sandy and getting to know her and learning about her work? What has it meant to your curatorial practice? And how do you see the historic works of art in our collections or the documents, treasures in our library, by working with someone like Sandy, who both has the kind of more traditional research scholarly acumen, but also real hands-on, familiarity with the stuff that art is made out of.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that I love most about the Huntington is that there's so many different specialists in different areas, and we can bring all of our knowledge to a particular question historically or to a particular object. We have conservators, librarians, researchers, historians, obviously botanical specialists. So we already have that kind of built into the fabric of the Huntington, which is so spectacular. But what Sandy adds is a whole nother layer of creativity. And like a constant questioning that enlivens the conversation at all times. And her incredible, her inquisitiveness, but her knowledge through practice is also quite astounding. And, she brings these things to life and makes them, relevant to our modern day, which is very special.
Sandy, then conversely for you, What I know that you're a bit hampered by COVID considerations at the moment, but what does it mean for you to be here when you're on site, and as you imagine the time still that you have to spend here? New Huntington for you must be a kind of one-stop shopping in a way. You can get your hands literally on sort of field specimens, but also several centuries old, historical documents. So what does a place like this, a repository of artistic and literary and botanical treasures, mean to you, and what have you been surprised by so far, and how do you think it might shape your work going forward?
Oh, Christina, it is an absolute thrill to have access to all of these materials that I can access just digitally online, and to have access to the human resources, the experts, from my conversations with Dennis to the botanicals collection, and soon with the librarians. I'll tell you that having an institution where I can really pull all of the threads that I have to pull across time and space over months and months across, say, the Western US, but to be able to do it in one location is extraordinary. And with the assets that are available at the Huntington, I know I have not scratched the surface with the materials that I can access online, because the holdings are so in depth. One of the things that I've shared with Dennis on a number of occasions is that as I'm doing my research with these more recent articles and journals, every time I'm going into the footnotes, Christina, I'm finding that the sources go back to the Huntington. And so it's a matter of really just prioritizing which areas of the collection I want to go deeper with, and which areas of the collection I really like to spend more time with, because certainly the 14 weeks is not enough time.
Well, you have an open invitation. Believe me. We have some questions. Nancy Berman is wondering, are there botanical specimens growing here at the Huntington that are going to be relevant to your work and that you might want to add into your current painting?
That is a wonderful question, Nancy. And I'll tell you that I have been fortunate enough to receive a few spreadsheets with several hundred specimens listed that I get to cross-reference and see which ones I really want to focus in on. But it's going to be a matter of spending some time in the gardens, doing drawings, looking at those lists, comparing them to colonial Central Mexican sources, Southern California sources, and really understanding which ones, because you don't want to crowd a composition. You can crowd a sketchbook and that is perfectly fine. But what I want to do is really, in that map that I showed you, the You Are Here, in the foreground, there will be featured botanicals from the Huntington's collection, both the gardens as well as the historic sources.
Okay. Question again for you, Sandy. Can you talk about, to the extent of your knowledge around indigenous color, which comes mainly from colonial Spanish documents, by using mate in California and representing present history, are you somehow reversing the colonial perspective on indigenous knowledge?
I don't know about reversing. I will say that having been born into a family of painters, I am from 4 generations of Mexican and Latinx painters. Everything that I grew up around was canvas and oil and wood. And to really understand that I have an opportunity to explore alternative supports, alternative materials that are invested in an art history of the Americas, is again about reaffirming an art history that I'm so excited to share with contemporary audiences.
Thank you. A particular question to the Huntington site from from Ethan Lipsig, one of our great sort of garden Huntington family members. Sandy, will you be using cochineal insects growing on Huntington opuntias? Hope I'm saying that correctly.
I'll tell you, I've had some very, very interesting experiments with my Caltech class on processing the cochinilla. I do have the full scale insects, and we have processed them. There are a number of results, and the results do vary depending on the alkalinity of the mortar pestle that you use, as well as the pH level of the water that you use, as well as a number of other variables. So while I may try, I cannot say for sure if it will be that particular one.
Excellent. A question for you, and first praise. The way you connect the past to the present, Sandy, is extremely powerful. Do you see the past as represented in your everyday as a burden, or is it liberating?
I think it is incredibly empowering to understand that while I am a painter in 2021, that I come from generations and generations and generations of painters, scribes, scholars of the Americas, and that I'm not doing this work alone. I'm doing this work with every painter that existed before me, and that we have an opportunity to, again, inspire contemporary audiences by layering the present with the past in a way that allows us to see that we too will live through this.
Thank you very much. Dennis, I'm wondering if you want to comment on this sort of interweaving between past, present, and kind of thinking about future projects here at the Huntington.
Yeah, well, Sandy's work really presents so clearly to me all the different layers of time in our landscape, indigenous, colonial layers, contemporary layers that connect with our audiences and all of our staff. So I think looking into the future, we'll have an opportunity through Sandy's work and through others' work to show audiences, this deeper history of time, which is so critical to understanding, where we are. You are here is kind of a very powerful statement, but that means many different things, which is what Sandy's work is trying to get at. And Sandy was an educator for many years at the Getty, other places, so she's very adept at presenting these themes to audiences. And I think, moving forward, we'll hopefully, use Sandy's acumen in that area to help us. It's, not just presenting it, but, it's sharing it with audiences. That is really key.
Absolutely. So I'd like to acknowledge that we are coming up on the end of our time, and I would like to say thank you again to both of you, Dennis and Sandy. You have, I think, really given us so much food for thought and shown so beautifully, really illustrated so beautifully the many different strands from the collections here at the Huntington. It's been kind of incredibly powerful, our tribute to our founders, who not only believed in the power of art, but the sort of love of books and history, and the importance of the natural world and plants. And so I really thank very, very profoundly the two of you for bringing those things together. And Dennis and Sandy, thank you also for helping us remember Arabella and also Archer, and Archer's interest, of course, in Hispanic society and Spanish-speaking world, but also Henry's collecting for the library in particular. And we will hope to continue to honor their legacy going forward, and think about all of the scholarly, botanical, creative, artistic voices, Sandy, yours very much included, that can help us flesh out our shared history and make sense of our current moment. So thank you both very, very much. And thanks to everyone watching today. Much appreciated, and be well, everyone.